Hello, hello. Lovely to have you here. What I want to discuss today is the topic of low self-esteem, of self-hatred. This is something that many of us are familiar with from our own lives, and I don't consider myself excluded from that. I've felt these kinds of feelings myself during my life at various times, and so I'm sympathetic to anybody who is in a similar situation. Now, the wonderful Buddhist teacher Sharon Salzberg has discussed issues of low self-esteem and self-hatred at many times in her books. She writes a lot in particular about loving kindness, what's called metta in Buddhism, these practices that are so important. And one of the, I think, fascinating histories that she recounts in her books, and in particular in her book on loving kindness, is an interaction she had with the Dalai Lama, where she brought up to him this concern she had over low self-esteem, over self-hatred within our contemporary culture. She brought it up to the Dalai Lama as a concern of hers, and surprisingly, even maybe to some of us shockingly, the Dalai Lama expressed that he was not familiar with this idea at all and was completely confused by it. So the idea of this seemed completely foreign to him. And I think it might be useful to some of us who are caught within these ideas of self-hatred or low self-esteem to be aware at least that this is potentially just simply cultural, that there are people in other cultures who simply never experience similar kinds of mental states. That at least can relieve us of some of the burden of feeling that this is normal and natural for us. Now, this encounter that Sharon Salzberg had with the Dalai Lama has been described on a number of occasions. I'll leave some links to descriptions down below in the notes. But I was always left sort of wanting more. I was sort of wondering, I would love to have been a fly on the wall there and have heard the discussion going on. And what would the Dalai Lama have said? And the descriptions that we often find are very short. They don't really say a whole lot other than that the Dalai Lama was surprised. But recently it came to my awareness that actually this discussion that the Dalai Lama had, the interaction with Sharon Salzberg and indeed other people at the time, had been recorded and transcribed, and indeed was available as at least a small chapter in a book of discussions with the Dalai Lama. I have a copy of it right here. And I'll leave a link to this down below in the notes, Healing Emotions. There's also an excerpt, a pretty lengthy excerpt of this particular part that I'll be discussing today on the web. I'll also leave a link to that down below in the notes. So there's a lot of stuff down there in case you're interested in this particular discussion. But in any event, in today's video, what I want to do is to describe a couple of different threads in that discussion. I can't go obviously into all of it. It's quite lengthy and deep. But a couple of threads I want to pull out here. The first thread is basically, where does this idea of self-hatred or low self-esteem come from? Where does this emotional state come from? There were a number of different hypotheses by people at the meeting that I think are worth spending some time on. And secondly, what are the antidotes that we can use to counteract this kind of low self-esteem? And in the discussion, there are, as I can see it, 4 separate suggested practices that we can use to try to counteract this. So first, where and why do we find this low self-esteem or self-hatred in the world? Now, it seems from this discussion as though, from the Dalai Lama's point of view, it is not something that we find in Tibetan culture. Now, when I first heard this, one of my thoughts was, well, maybe that's just the Dalai Lama, right? I mean, the Dalai Lama is a very particular person. He's hardly going to be representative of all Tibetans. Perhaps it's just he who doesn't understand it. However, one of the things in the discussion is that there are at least 1 or 2, as far as I can tell, other Tibetans that are mentioned in the discussion. One of them is the Dalai Lama's own interpreter, Thubten Jinpa. And he also seems to be surprised by it. He thinks that it must be cultural, that these ideas of self-hatred arise due to the culture, the influences of the culture. So there doesn't seem to be any pushback from other Tibetans around, which suggests, again, that Thupten Jinpa is right, that this is a cultural issue having to do with some aspect of Western culture. But more than that, it seems that this syndrome of self-hatred or low self-esteem is centered in the United States. That is, the Dalai Lama asks his audience whether there are similar syndromes within either Latin America, South America, or Europe. And the scientist Francisco Varela, who was born in Chile but lived for many years in France, says that he does not see it really in Europe or in South America. On the other hand, he does see it in the United States. He, in particular, talks about a lot of talk of self-esteem within the United States, that Americans seem to be very interested in bolstering their self-esteem with a certain kind of talk, and he sees that as indicating their own low self-esteem, basically, and that they're trying to basically keep this self-esteem up through language of a certain kind. And the religious scholar Lee Yearley, who was also at this meeting, talks to the Dalai Lama about early America in the early 19th century, as described by the French intellectual Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote a very, very important book chronicling America at the time, really in its infancy as a new country. And what Alexis de Tocqueville finds, is what he calls American nervousness. Now, it's been a while since I read de Tocqueville. Speaking for myself, Lee Yearley doesn't go into this in a whole lot of detail, but my recollection of de Tocqueville, and you'll have to, correct me if I'm wrong here, but my recollection is that de Tocqueville makes some important points about European versus American society in particular. That in European society, basically everybody knows one's place. Because one knows one's family's place, one's family has lived in a particular location for perhaps centuries. One also knows one's place in the societal rankings, because those are based also on birth and nobility and such things. Whereas when people came to the early United States, all of that was left behind. People in the United States were much more mobile. They would tend to move from place to place. They would tend to take different jobs every few years. They would not remain within, let's say, their father's business. And they had left behind this idea of social ranking, at least as based on name, family, nobility. For that, however, was substituted the social ranking based on wealth. And what happens then is you get a society that is in constant turmoil, that your own ranking was temporary, depending on how much wealth you could make for yourself, that it was always prone to you failing at some point and falling down on the social ladder, and that there was this constant striving, that you were always trying to get better than the people next to you. You really could gain a higher social standing through hard work and making wealth in various ways that one makes wealth, in a way that you couldn't in Europe. I mean, in Europe, if you made a lot of wealth, that did not necessarily increase your social standing. Indeed, it could increase a certain amount of stigma for you, because social standing was based upon name. Now, this gets us quite far afield from the Dalai Lama and Buddhism, so I'm not going to spend any more time on it. I just want to say that it seems, at least if Lee Yearley is right, that perhaps America is different in that the nervousness, this kind of angst or neuroticism that we find in America is due to this kind of being unmoored and our inability to deal with change, the constant change, which is actually more in our face in the United States, or at least historically, than it was in Europe, and that may indeed be associated with our sense of low self-esteem, that we're always having to strive, that we're never sure where we are. Now, the second point here is what we can do about this issue of either low self-esteem or self-hatred, however we're going to describe it. What can we do about it? Now, the first thing to notice is that we can do something about it. There is something we can do. We shouldn't consider that we're condemned to this kind of low self-esteem for our entire lives, or that we're helpless in the face of it. One psychologist there, Dan Brown, talks about a particular technique that he uses based on cognitive therapy, a sort of cognitive psychology, cognitive therapy approach to this problem, which is that he has his patients come, and when they have this issue with low self-esteem, he has them write up the kinds of thoughts that they go through on one side of a piece of paper. Their low self-esteem self-talk. You know, I'm no good, or I'm no good at this, or whatever it might be. And then he has them write up what we might call antidotes to that negative self-talk on the other side. That is, things of positive self-talk, positive things that we can say about ourselves that might counteract our knee-jerk tendency to be negative. And then he tells his patients to take the positive column, the thoughts in the positive column, and basically to reflect upon those every day for a certain amount of time, almost like a mantra, to go through and say, to repeat to ourselves on a regular basis our own positive self-talk. And that way we can sort of use that positive self-talk to replace the negative self-talk over a period of time. Again, because if we can think of, indeed even the Buddha says that if we continue a way of thinking, it will become part of our normal thought pattern. And so we have to practice this. Now, when the Dalai Lama hears this from Dan Brown, he has an interesting reflection. The Dalai Lama says, if there's no genuine sense of love underlying all that emotion, then even if others praise you, you're not affected by that praise. When others praise a person with low self-esteem, he or she says they're wrong. The method that Dan Brown described about affirmations to counter negative feelings was almost like reminding the patients of their own value. When the patients read the list of negative words on one side and positive words on the other, it reminds them that they can do something. They actually are worthy in these ways, and it seems to help them. But unless one assumes that there is some kind of self-love underlying their emotion, it would be difficult to understand. There would be no motivation. That is to say that the techniques that Dan Brown suggests, this one technique, this one practice, wouldn't work if there weren't some reservoir of self-love sort of underlying this apparent self-hatred that we see so readily in our lives. That's really the self-love that is there, that we're trying to get in touch with, that it's been sort of covered over. Now, actually, the Buddha recommends a very similar kind of practice to this, to the one that Dan Brown suggests, in an early sutta of his. In this sutta, the Buddha says, take a mendicant who's focusing on some foundation of meditation that gives rise to bad, unskillful thoughts connected with desire, hate, and delusion. That mendicant should focus on some other foundation of meditation connected with the skillful. In other words, if a monastic is obsessing about thoughts that, let's say, involve hatred towards themselves, low self-esteem, they should look around for some more skillful way of thinking and try to substitute the skillful for the unskillful. In other words, think of some positive, it might be positive self-affirmation, and focus on that in the meditation or in daily life in order to get rid of the unskillful thoughts. And here the Buddha gives a simile. He says, it's like a deft carpenter or their apprentice who knock out or extract a large peg with a finer peg. So here the large peg is this negative self-talk, and the finer peg is the positive self-talk. And so if we hammer out the negative with the positive, we will be left with the positive. That at least is the practice suggested by the Buddha and indeed by Dan Brown using cognitive therapy. There's an interesting way in which the therapeutic techniques of now mirror those of 2,500 years ago. So this is one practice. Another practice, which is suggested by Sharon Salzberg herself, is that we spend time considering our own ethical practice. That is to say, that we spend time, either ourselves or teachers of ours spend time reflecting on moral living, on right living, on ethical living, on right action, right speech, right livelihood, and such things. As Sharon Salzberg notes, this is done so that people can respect themselves for leading a more virtuous life. So the problem here is one of low self-esteem. But we can help to bolster that self-esteem by reflecting upon the good things, the ethical things, the moral things that we do in our lives. Helping people, at least not harming people, being kind to one another. These are the things that we can do with relative ease, at least many of us can, and they can serve as a kind of a stepping stone for us to get towards more of a sense of self-worth. Indeed, the Buddha himself recommends that we spend time reflecting upon our own beneficial actions in the past, that this practice of recollection, a recollection practice that involves our own beneficial actions in the past, can be one that can gladden the mind. And if we're gladdening our mind, we're going to be helping to overcome this kind of negative self-talk. And if this is done properly, it can lead to a really beneficial sense of healthy self-respect. And I did a video on the topic of these recollection practices that I'll leave down a link to down in the show notes. Now, the psychologist Jon Kabat-Zinn suggests another practice that we can use for countering negative self-talk or this kind of low self-esteem. Now, many of us will know that Jon Kabat-Zinn is the originator of mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is probably the premier way that mindfulness is used in a therapeutic context within a general secular world. In other words, with people who are both Buddhist and non-Buddhist, within hospitals and so on. And Jon Kabat-Zinn recommends basically a form of mindfulness to help us deal with this kind of negative self-talk. He notes that the practice of mindfulness is a practice of learning to let thoughts go, learning to see thoughts as simply coming and going as part of the furniture of the mind, that they're not things to cling to, they're not necessarily things that we should believe in. And so when negative self-talk arises, say we hear in our minds the thought, I'm no good, or I'm no good at that, or I'm not a good person, or whatever it might be, we learn simply to see it as another object of the mind that simply goes, that arises and passes, that we're not responsible for. It's just a thought, it's just another thought, it's not ours, it's simply arising and passing in the mind. And that if we can learn to do that, we can learn to let these thoughts go instead of our normal tendency, which is to tend to believe the thoughts that arise in our mind. We learn to not necessarily believe everything that we think. So as we stop believing in these thoughts and we're willing to let them go, we're able to achieve a much better sense of balance. That's the point that Jon Kabat-Zinn makes, is that we can reach a much deeper sense of balance and equanimity as we see these thoughts come and go in the mind, and in such a place, they will tend to arise less often. Now, the final practice is one that is suggested both by Sharon Salzberg and by the Dalai Lama himself, is one of loving kindness, of not just practicing loving kindness, which is itself a wonderful practice, but practicing loving kindness directed at oneself. And this is an important practice because, or at least it's an interesting practice, because it's not one that the Buddha himself discussed ever. The Buddha never discussed directing loving kindness towards oneself, at least not explicitly. and later scholars or later practitioners did, such as Buddhaghosa, but the Buddha himself did not. But both of them suggest, that is to say, both Sharon Salzberg and the Dalai Lama think that that is an important part of our contemporary practice. And I think we can see why, because many of us need a practice of kindness towards ourselves because we aren't necessarily in touch with such a practice. And indeed, I did a recent video about the Buddha's own discussion on loving kindness towards oneself, and I'll leave a link to that up here on the screen if you haven't seen it. If you're getting something out of these videos, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked down below, and seeing if you want to help support the channel and the work that we're all doing here. Thanks so much to all of my patrons over on Patreon. Thanks to all of you for watching, and we'll catch you on the next video.